All right, it looks like we're ready to get started. So I wanted to introduce Doug Gribbins. He's our solution engineer at Blameless. And today we're going to go through walking through configuring SLOs in Blameless. So Doug, do you mind introducing yourself?
Sure. Thank you, Crystal. Again, my name is Doug Gribbins. As you heard, I'm on the west side of Denver. I'm a solutions engineer here at Blameless. And my role here is basically assisting customers and also assisting with the technical side of the sales process. So again, as Crystal mentioned, go ahead and put any questions into chat, and hopefully we have some time at the end and we can address several of those. If not, what we'll do is we'll take a note and we'll go ahead and get back to you by email. As Crystal said, this is actually episode 3 of the Show Me series. And if you'd like to see the other 2, I would invite you to go to blameless.com, go to the resources tab and select resources library. That'll open up kind of a secondary menu, if you will, and then select webinars and you'll see the previous 2. And as Crystal also said, we have these every month. So we invite you to join in regularly. So here's our agenda today. I'm going to talk about what's SLOs and SLIs. I'm also going to throw another couple of terms or definitions at you. Some of you may have heard them, but if you haven't, they're kind of key to SLOs and SLIs. I'll show you how to create an SLO and actually an SLI as well. Very simple to do in the Blameless UI. And that way, once you have SLOs up and running, everyone can kind of focus on what they need to do. We'll also talk a little bit about fine-tuning your SLOs over time. So it's kind of a process of iteration and improvement. And then we'll also have 3 poll questions, kind of for our own iteration at Blameless. We're just kind of curious as to where everyone is in this particular process. So we hope you'll join in on that. I would also please go ahead and check out this particular page on the Blameless site. This is going over a lot of what I'm going to talk about today. It's the comprehensive guide on SLIs, SLOs, and error budgets. So it's very good background foundation, if you will, on the whole SLO, SLI, and SRE. So again, I put that into a tiny URL because it's kind of long. So anyway, with that, let's go ahead and get started. So in SRE, or Site Reliability Engineering, you'll hear a lot about SLOs and SLIs, but sometimes people will confuse those with what are called SLAs. And SLAs are actually contractual agreements between a vendor and an end user, end customer, if you will. And they are guaranteeing, if you will, a quality of service. And actually, if the vendor does not provide that or kind of breaks the guarantee, so to speak, typically there'll be monetary damages, or, you know, if you got perhaps like a year contract with them, maybe they'll give you another 3 months or something like that. So they're similar, but truly not in the same ballpark, let's say, as SLOs and SLIs. So what are SLOs and SLIs? SLOs are service level objectives, and SLIs are service level indicators, both a vital part of site reliability engineering. So speaking of that, Google has really kind of set the bar with developing and refining, I guess you could say, SRE and the whole SRE practice. They've stated that fundamentally, SRE begins with the concept of, for anything like a service or process or even a application, it must be available. So for example, if you're an e-commerce company or something like that, if you're selling something on the internet and people try and go to your site and it's not available, then it's not good for anybody, especially your company, if that's, you know, your source of income. And by the way, I've already said availability several times, but Google has said that there's 4, as they call them, golden signals, and they are availability, latency, throughput, and saturation. So the terms are kind of interchangeable, if you will. You'll hear me say availability a lot, but certainly they are interchangeable. And by the way, I've also put a link on the screen And you should be able to find that in the chat. I think Crystal would be kind enough to put that down there. So for more information about SRE and what Google says about it, excuse me, please go to the link on the screen. So we've established the importance of availability or latency, et cetera. How do we then quantify availability? Well, I'm sure a lot of you have probably heard this quote. It's attributed to Dr. W. Edwards Deming. So Dr. Deming said, "It is wrong to suppose that if you can't measure it, you can't manage it," a costly myth. So it's certainly true, a lot of truth to that. If we can monitor it, then we can manage it and we can quantify it. So if we can quantify it, then we'll know if it's getting better or hopefully not, it's getting worse. And what we can also do is we can break that down into the constituent parts. So we can tell which of these, if you think of a chain, for example, which of these links of the chain do we need to improve to have overall improvement? So although Dr. Deming passed away, probably like 3 decades ago, his words are still essentially very important today. So how do we measure things? Well, that's where SLOs and SLIs come in. So I think a lot of people, they kind of concentrate on the customer facing systems, but really when you get down to it, the internal processes and systems are just as important. So that's where we're going to use SLOs and SLIs, because if your internal, the people you work with, if they can't use or utilize their applications or their mission critical systems, then your company is equally likely to fail. So both are important. As I say, a lot of people will focus on the customer facing systems, but really both are equally as important as well. So now, companies will typically want to set a very high bar for availability. You may have heard, for example, 5 nines of availability for something. Well, that's all well and good. It sounds very impressive, but literally 5 nines of availability a year literally bakes out to about 26 seconds a month where you cannot be available. That's very difficult to actually maintain that kind of thing. And in fact, it's difficult to achieve, especially for the person that is trying to make that happen, like our friend Kevin here in DevOps. So here is broken down all the nines, if you will. You can see that 4 nines of availability translates to about 53 minutes of a year, or a little more than 4.5 minutes a month. So that really doesn't give us a lot of leeway. It's very hard to maintain that level of availability. And keep in mind that availability can be very expensive to maintain at this level. If, for example, you're shooting for 5 nines or 4 nines, you have 26 seconds or 4.5 minutes. That's very expensive. You're going to need a crew of people to essentially be on call 24 hours a day to reach that type of availability. And it really kind of determines on what your company decides is, how available are we going to truly be? So that brings us to SLOs. So what's an SLO? Well, an SLO is a service level objective, and that's where you're setting what is acceptable for your company. So you may, you make a decision essentially that you're going to be 3 nines, 99.9% available. Well, truly what you're saying is we will only be unavailable 0.1% of the time. So again, very hard to maintain this level of availability. And again, in the lower box here, SLOs are what set customer expectations. So again, when we say customer, we're talking both external as well as internal customers. So I promised a couple of other terms or definitions, if you will. So the first one is what we call error budget. So we just saw that with 3 nines of availability, we essentially have a little more than 43 minutes of time to be unavailable per month. Well, those 43 minutes in essence are what we call your error budget. They're the amount of time that you can spend not being available. So along with an error budget, we also have what we call the burn rate. And the burn rate is the rate at which we are using up our error budget. So error budget is something we're shooting for, and burn rate is essentially how fast are we using up that error budget. Okay, this brings us to SLIs, or service level indicators, excuse me, which are a direct measurement of a service process, or again, possibly an application. Measuring if that service is available or capable of delivering what it needs to be is, in essence, the service level indicator. So we can think of the SLO as our goal, and the SLI tells us how we're doing in reaching that goal. So in essence, that's what we're talking about. And now what I want to do is I want to show you how to set up SLIs and SLOs in the Blameless UI. But first, as promised, we want to ask of you 3 questions. So our first poll question is, do you operate with SLOs today with your team? So a little poll should pop up on your screen. Our answers here are A, yes, B, no, and C, don't know, not sure. So again, poll question number 1, do you operate with SLOs today with your team? Yes, no, or don't know. A couple more seconds. Crystal, do we have some answers?
Yep. So it looks like we have 38% yes, 25% no, and 38% don't know.
Wow, interesting. So there are people, I think the further we go along, we are seeing more and more people kind of address this. So that's great. And that's going to take us to our next question. So if you answered yes, for those 38% that answered, we're curious, how many SLOs are you optimizing for today? So again, A, 1 to 5, B, 5 to 10, C, 10 to 15, and D, more than 15. So give it another second. Again, poll question number 2. If yes, how many SLOs are you optimizing for today? And a couple more seconds. So Crystal, how are we doing? And what do we got?
So we have 1 to 5, 50%, 5
Wow.
to 10, 25%, 15 plus, 25%.
Wow, 15 plus. That's really advanced. So that's impressive. Very good. Very good. And our final question of the morning or afternoon, depending on where you're at. Poll question number 3, do you actively share SLO charts and reports with teams outside of engineering? So for example, product support, your executives. So we're curious if this is, this kind of bakes it down to, is this a company-wide thing, or, is this just in engineering or DevOps or something like that? So once again, poll question number 3, do you actively share SLO charts and reports with teams outside of engineering? So we'll give it another couple of seconds. Yes, no, or I don't know.
It looks like we have 67% yes and 33% don't know.
Wow, fantastic. Well, that's great. We certainly appreciate people answering those questions. So with that, what I'm going to do is let's go ahead and go over to the demo walkthrough. So I'm going to take you over to the Blameless UI. If I can find my mouse, there it is in the show. And here, oops, look at that. It's timed out. So, and actually, I'm going to refer to this. So let me just go back to that real quick. Get signed in. All right. So as I say, here is the Blameless UI. You'll notice the vertical menu on the left there. We have things like incidents, which is what we're looking at here. We have things like postmortems, etc. But just quickly, incidents, when you create a incident in the Blameless UI, this is where you'll see all the current incidents. I won't go into one for time's sake, but you can see we can set things like severity, you set a status. We can put a who's the commander of the incident. If you go in, you'll see timelines. You see some other things like, for example, maybe the incident was noted at noon, but perhaps customers were not affected until maybe 2 p.m. or something like that. So we can kind of play with the times as far as, if you're counting against your SLOs, you might think, okay, well, customers weren't affected for 2 hours. So let's don't count that against our SLO. And then, as I mentioned, what you can do at the end is you can go ahead and create a postmortem. So it's kind of an overview of the entire incident. This is what happened. This is how it was resolved, et cetera. So I also mentioned that once we go ahead and do that, we can post the postmortem. Some people call them retrospectives. We call them currently postmortems. We might go to retrospectives in the future, depending on how everybody feels. But SLO manager is where we're going to set up the SLOs, the SLIs included. We also have reliability insights, where we're taking the metadata that we're collecting constantly, and we can go in there and create a wealth of different dashboards, a lot of like mean time to resolution, things like that. Who all was involved, how are we doing with our SLOs, et cetera. Just a wealth of dashboards, and we can also essentially export those. And then finally, the last thing I'll talk about here is the run books, or some people call them playbooks. So inside of an incident, if this thing occurs several times, maybe it occurs like once or twice a month or something like that. Maybe there's like 8 steps that need to be done. Well, usually we call Larry and IT, but Larry's sailing the Caribbean this month or something like that. So what we can do is we can then put those steps inside of what's called a run book. We can put code samples, what have you, and then we can paste that into the incident type, the incident template, if you will. And then the next time that happens, we've got that, right at hand. So, now we're not spending an hour trying to get a hold of Larry. We can just go ahead and go through those steps. So in essence, that is a quick look at Blameless, the UI. But as I mentioned, we're going to go into the SLO manager, and this is the SLO manager. And then there it refreshes. So this is a place where we can create, track how we're doing with our SLOs and SLIs, and how we're doing with our error budgets that you'll see here in a second. So at the top, you see it's called user journeys. Well, a user journey is just a sequence, if you will, of tasks that are based on SLOs. So you might have a user journey, say, for example, based on a user's experience of using the shopping cart. Or in the case of the app user login down here that I'm going to click on here in a second, it's just the user's experience of logging in and using various parts of the application. But at the top, you can see we have ranges for how long before depletion of all our SLOs. So we can see that we have 3 SLOs that we estimate will be depleted in more than 20 days. We have 0 that we estimate will be depleted in less than 5 days, or 20 to 5 days. We actually have 2 that have been depleted, and we have 1 that is currently inactive. So again, good place to come for a quick check as to how we're doing with all of our SLOs. So below that, we have all of our user journeys. So I'm going to go ahead and open up the app user login, and you can see we have 3 SLOs currently configured. We have the SLI types, which availability and latency. I'll talk about that a little bit in just a minute or two. We have the reliability target. And so that's what we're shooting for with our SLO. So that is our target, what we're looking for. And next to that, we have service level. And that's how we're actually doing against that target currently. Then we have status. Again, a little bit more on that. We have 3 different statuses, just a second or two. I'll talk about that. And then we have a section that is dedicated to error budget. So how much error budget is remaining as a percentage, what's our current burn rate, and an estimate of when we might be depleted for that particular SLO. So we've set all of this up, and essentially the SLOs have their own SLI underneath there. So with that, what I'm going to do is I'm going to open up the Blamo availability, and I'll start at the bottom. And you can see at the bottom, we have an SLO objective graph. So the horizontal line in the middle right here, that's showing us our reliability target. And in this case, we set that to 90%. And then we can see on the graph that somewhere around the 12th, we exceeded our error budget, and now we are below our target availability. So at this point, if a company is serious about availability, this would be a good time to pretty much stop, take a step back, and efforts would begin, I guess you could say, to get back on track. So a good place to kind of examine at that point would be the graph above it, which is SLO events. And here we can see that we are showing good events versus valid events. And you'll notice for each day, there's a significant amount less valid events than, significant amount less good events than our valid events. So it would behoove a company to figure out, okay, why is that true? Let's go and investigate. And then our top graph essentially is showing us how we're doing against our error budget. You know, what is the depletion, if you will? So as I mentioned, one of the things I want to talk about is the iteration process of improvement. So let's talk about that. This SLO is set to 90%, and yet we see that our error budget has been exceeded. So if the company, you know, truly makes an effort at this point to figure out why the good events are low compared to the valid events, then they can go ahead and take steps to improve whatever process or service it is. So when they do that, essentially, obviously, availability would improve. And with that improvement, perhaps once they've gotten to a point where they are 90%, perhaps their next step or their next goal could then be shooting for maybe 95%. And keep in mind, as they begin to improve their processes and systems, the overall health and well-being of the company would naturally improve. So for example, let's say this was an e-commerce company and they go through the process to improve their availability by 5%. It would stand to reason that the profits from the website should also improve by approximately 5%. And so it's this constant process of iterate and improve. And as I said, once they hit 95%, perhaps the next logical step is shooting for 99%. And then if you're ambitious, you know, shoot for that 3 nines, 99.9%. And let me also say, when you start with SLOs, generally you'll want to start with your most mission critical applications, processes, the stuff that really matters, the stuff that's important. And typically we would suggest start with a few SLOs, be realistic, maybe set a target of 95%, give it a month, give it 6 weeks, see how you do. And remember, you want to involve more than just operations and development and engineering. Get everybody involved. This is a company-wide initiative, company-wide effort. You know, maybe get desktop services involved. So again, you know, it's a case of let's try and set this bar. Let's fix the problems as they come up. Let's iterate and improve. And that's it. That's kind of the secret to a constant case of let's see where we're at. Okay, we fix those problems. Maybe let's shoot for something a little bit higher. Hopefully that all makes sense. Excuse me, dry here, dry. All right, so let's go back to SLOs. So since SLOs are based off of an existing SLI, we first need to create the SLI prior to creating the SLO. So what I'm going to do here is I've got another tab, and this is, oops, let me actually get over here. Well, let's go back here, and service level indicators. Must have switched that somewhere. I'm going to take this guy. So again, this is an existing SLI. I won't create one because you just watch me type. So in this case, I'm going to take the customer response latency. So to create the SLI, what we do is give it a name, and then we give you an area that you can come in and give as detailed an explanation as you would like. Again, you might not be the only person that is working with these. So good to give an explanation of what this thing is doing. So below that, again, I talked a little bit earlier about the golden signals from Google. And so we can create this SLI type as availability, latency, throughput, or saturation. In this case, obviously, this is an availability one. Then we have down here the good events versus valid events that we visited earlier. So here, I guess, natural question, what's a good event? What's a valid event? So a good event is a good response. It doesn't necessarily have to be an HTTP 200 response. Many times it is, but sometimes it's not. For example, if our query, maybe it does a redirection. So in that case, an HTTP 302 response may be appropriate. But typically something like a 500 level response or server not responding would obviously not be a good response. Probably something that we don't want. So, and then valid events. What's a valid event? Well, a valid event means a request was sent. And actually, let me kind of flip the switch, if you will. It may be better to consider what is not a valid event. Examples of which might be perhaps the response comes back malformed, or it didn't come back as SSL, or maybe the response came back as a 404 error, something like that. But it becomes incumbent upon the person that is setting up the SLI to decide what is a good event and what is a valid event, how we're measuring that. And so that's that. So next, you see we have a data source here of Pingdom. So what we've done is we've set up a process on Pingdom. You can see the name. It's called Blameless Demo Incidents. But we also have integrations with Datadog, obviously Pingdom, Prometheus, and New Relic. But we also have an API that you can use to essentially pull data from just about any other data source. So that is setting up an SLI. Now, this is already set up, but you would go ahead and save. I'll also point out we have an ingest log here. So if you're troubleshooting, you could come into the ingest log. Did we get a full hour's worth of data points, 2 hours ago? So you can check the ingest log to see how we're doing. All right. So now that we've set up our SLI, the next thing we need to do is essentially create an SLO. So I'm going to come back to user journeys. And this time I'm going to click on app user login. And this is going to show us the current SLOs that we already saw. We had 3: Blamo availability, user checkout, authentication, latency. So now if I wanted to add an SLO, I'll go ahead and click the button. Now we need to figure out which SLI. So we're going to use available services. Here's that customer response I was just working with. So just seeing the SLI that we just set up. Again, the name, definition, availability type, Pingdom, yada, yada. And we click next. So if I can find my mouse. And this is where we're going to set up the actual SLO itself. So I'm going to go ahead and I should have test in here. There it is. All right. And now we're going to specify our reliability target. Well, click in here. We saw before that we had a reliability target of 90%. So that gives us a total error budget of 3 days, 19 hours, 12 minutes. And of course, if we change this to 95 now, it gives us 1 day, 9 hours, and 36 minutes. All right. So the question now is relative to what? Is this for a month, a week? Well, at Blameless, what we do is we base this on 4 weeks, 4 contiguous weeks of, say, Sunday to Saturday, perhaps Monday or Wednesday to Tuesday. So it's 4 7-day weeks tied together. So we're using a 28-day rolling average. That's key. 28-day rolling average. So this total error budget of 1 day, 9 hours, 36, that is our total error budget in Blameless using the Blameless UI at 95% SLO reliability target. Hopefully that makes sense. If not, throw the question in the chat. All right. So now what we're going to do is we're going to go to and set a status, as I mentioned earlier. We have 3 statuses. Maybe your SLO is under development. Maybe we're testing it, or once we want to go live and just actively monitor, then we go ahead and set that to active. So hopefully that makes sense. Very easy to set up an SLI and then set a SLO accordingly. All right. The last thing we're going to do is we're going to give it an error budget policy. And give me about 30 seconds and we're going to talk about what is an error budget policy. So in this case, I'm just going to choose the low priority error budget policy. I click finish. It's going to take us back. And now here you see our test SLO in the Blameless UI. This would refresh in a second, but let me just go ahead and force the refresh. Let's try it one more time. All right. Well, taking a second here. So that's it in a nutshell. That is us essentially creating SLIs, then creating associated SLOs with it. There we go. And now here is our test SLO, and you can see error budgets, service level, reliability target, etc. So that's it in a nutshell. Again, if you have questions, then go ahead and drop those into chat. I'm going to talk about that in just a second. So now let me go back. So I'm going to bring back and let's go to here and present that. So thanks for joining us today. We're going to get to the questions in a second. Let me just quickly summarize. Number one, if you're doing SLOs, create meaningful SLIs to base it on. Number two, you want to start small and then do that constant iteration and improvement process. Number three, I hope you saw that fairly easy and quick to create SLIs and an associated SLOs in the Blameless UI. And I guess the last tip I would say is keep an eye on those error budgets. You know, if you begin to drop, then address the problem before you've totally exhausted. And remember, you can set those notifications. Oh, gosh, you know what? The one thing I didn't do, let me go back. I apologize. Let me do this. I promised you this and just moved on without it. So let me bring this back up. Error budget policies, quickly. You can see we have 3 of the error budget policies. We give you a default one to work off of, but this is the one I selected. And so what we're doing is here, we can create notification policies, or just we'll create notifications based on 2 different things. Number one, a % error budget depleted, or number of days estimated before 100% depletion. So let me just pick this one. Give you an example here. So in this case, we're saying if we reach 75% error budget depleted, then we're going to go ahead and notify via email. And here you can see Nicholas is going to get an email. Actually, I could put myself in here if I wanted. So there I am right there. I could put myself in there. Oops. And we can also notify via a Slack channel. So here we're notifying, you know, the security incidents. We can also notify Slack users. And additionally, what we can do is when we get to that point, we can, in essence, create another Blameless incident. So we can give it severities of 1 through 4, if you will. And we also have created an incident type that is basically error budget depletion. So that is, and again, I apologize, but that is the error budget policies. And with that, I will go back and, all right. So we've talked about our tips here. We've got a couple of, essentially, again, here's that comprehensive guide on SLOs and SLIs and error budgets. And we also have an ebook. So bridging the gap from DevOps to SRE. We've got an ebook there. Now, if you've liked what you've seen, we invite you to sign up with Blameless You can do a free trial if you're interested. And by the way, oops, we're hiring. If you need a job, we invite you to, talk to us. I'm relatively new here. Got to tell you, great company, great people. I'm having a great time at Blameless. So yeah, if you're in the market or just want to work at a fun place, drop us a resume, give us a chat. So with that,
It looks like we have a lot of questions in the chat coming through.
all right. Well, actually, gosh, we're like 7 minutes over, but yeah, let's take, I don't know, 2 or 3 or 4. So hopefully I give you something quick. So Crystal, what's our first question?
How many SLOs should you start out with?
Well, I mentioned this. You don't want to, don't go overboard early. Start out with a couple. Really, the key is, as I said, usually this is like a company-wide initiative. So start with a couple. Sit down with everybody. What are your, what's mission critical? What are the things that we really need to have? Start with 2 or 3 maybe, and then again, it's that iterate and improve. So yeah, and another thing I would mention is, this is not a set it and forget it. This is something that really needs to be kind of revisited occasionally. So at least once a month, get the people involved. How are we doing? Is our air budget depleting quickly, et cetera. So it truly is something that must be revisited. But again, start small and, work your way up and start maybe at a 95%. And then after say 2 or 3 months, let's see if we can take that and exist at a 99% SLO. So hopefully that answers your question. How about another one, Crystal?
Okay, we have one from Chris. Does Blameless support multi-window, burn rate alerting as described by Google's SRE workbook?
Well, if I understand your question, we do make it so it's 1 SLO per SLI. So if you're saying multi-window from the aspect of can I do multiple SLOs? Not I guess terribly familiar with what you're saying, but like I say, if what I understand you're saying, I would tell you that yes, we have 1 SLI per SLO, and obviously you could make multiple SLOs for anything you want. So I hope, Chris, that answers your question. If not, put a little clarification in there. And if we don't have time here, we'll certainly get back to you. Crystal, how about one more? I've already kept them.
Actually, we can go through all of them, and if people would like to drop, they can drop, but we can just go through if people want to answer those questions. So we have a little bit more time. There's another question in the chat. It says, it looks pretty easy to integrate with PIGDOM, Site 24x7 sort of services. What if we want to track some internal pages inside of our application? Do we need to embed some Blameless code instead of our application?
Well, as far as like setting up the good events and valid events, we're depending on you to essentially give us a data stream. And again, we do have that API that, if you can come up with at your end a method of bringing that data back, then we're going to do that math on the backside. So hopefully it answers your question. So.
Okay. And then we have another one. Should you always measure availability as a starting point? And it looks like Chris actually was helping out with this answer. And he said, it's up to you on what you and your business partners think is important when you measure customer happiness. So what do you think?
Yeah, and I would add to that. Again, I probably used availability quite a few times, but Google does recommend those 4 golden signals. So availability, latency, throughput, and saturation. So I may be guilty of saying availability a lot, but that's what Google says. Use one of those 4 and base an SLI and accordingly an SLO on that. So hopefully that answers your question.
Okay, and then we have, what duration should you set an air budget for?
Oh, well, purely up to you. But again, if you're using the Blameless UI, and you'd be crazy, let's just say you'd be crazy, frankly, to not use it. But we're using that 28-day contiguous 4 weeks of rolling time period. So we kind of set that 28-day. So yeah, but you, in essence, you could basically base it on whatever you want. But yeah, 28 is really, I think, a really good number to base it on.
Great. And then Chris, we'll get back to you on section 6 that you were talking about. I'll have Doug email you so you guys can have a chat about that. And then thanks for everyone for coming. Yes, a recording will be sent to you after this, probably tomorrow. And then it will be also posted if any of your coworkers want to come on and watch this on demand version. We will be having that online as well. So thank you all for coming. Thank you, Doug. I really appreciate you. And we will be back on December 14th for a Show Me demo.
Excellent. Thanks, everybody.